The story begins with the main character, Harold, who is happily returning from the village, hoping to see the new house he had just finished building. But when he arrived, he fell to his knees in despair as he saw his beloved home had been burned to ashes. That house was the only thing he cherished in this world, and now that it was destroyed, Harold began to wonder if he had any reason left to live. In that moment, nothing mattered to him anymore. He wondered what had happened and what had caused it. When he returned from work that day, the house was already on fire, so it was clear he couldn't have caused it. This made Harold wonder if a new arsonist had appeared in town, someone who had decided to burn his house down at random. If the arsonist had to burn something, Harold wished they had chosen another place. As he was walking away from his burned-out home, he happened to overhear a man talking about a magic sword that he had found in a treasure room deep within the middle floors of the labyrinth. Harold knew that the labyrinth was a place where people could earn a lot of money just by exploring and catching monsters. But this news didn't really excite him. He knew very well that he had no special skills to complete that labyrinth. Harold was just an ordinary 25-year-old man with nothing special about him, which was probably why he had always worked so hard. Soon after, Harold realized he was completely broke. Because if he had a lot of money, he wouldn't be this devastated that his house had burned down. Thinking about his finances, he decided to go to the bank to see how much he had left in savings. After a few minutes, he arrived at the town bank, and the teller informed him that he only had 150,000 rubes left, an amount equivalent to 1 month's salary from his manual labor job. Although Harold was very poor, he had always been a hard worker. Besides his main job, he also took on side jobs in his free time. He even spent time gathering wild vegetables and herbs from the mountains to sell as cooking ingredients. Harold had once saved up over 20 million rubes, but most of that money had gone into building the house that had just been burned down. He informed the bank teller that he wanted to withdraw all his remaining money, reasoning that since there wasn't much left, he might as well just spend it all. Harold's first instinct was to buy an expensive meal, but then he thought that gambling might be a better idea. He arrived in front of a building where a sign advertised a slave auction. Harold had heard people talk about the slave trade before, but it wasn't a common sight. As he was about to walk past the building, a merchant stopped him and asked if he was interested in joining the slave auction. Harold replied that he was too poor to afford a slave. He knew that slaves usually cost at least 2 million rubes, and he himself didn't look like a rich person, so he wondered why this merchant was even talking to him. The merchant explained that he had slaves with starting bids as low as 10,000 rubes, and if he was lucky, Harold might even get one for cheaper. Initially, slaves were sold at a reserve price, which meant they could take a loss if necessary. But that was part of the fun of an auction. In any case, the merchant said Harold could come in and watch the auction if he wanted. A moment later, Harold entered the auction hall and was surprised by the number of people attending the event. He found an empty seat, and luckily, it was the last one available. At that moment, Harold realized the reason the merchant had been so eager to invite him in was because he wanted the participants to feel more excited seeing a full house. Shortly after, the merchant appeared on stage announcing that he represented a slave auction group that collected all kinds of slaves from all over. He promised that there would be a slave to suit the taste of every esteemed guest present. The auction officially began after each slave was introduced. The person who raised their hand and made the highest bid would become the buyer. The auction began with the introduction of a forest beauty, known as an elf. Upon seeing her, all the bidders immediately jumped into a frenzy because it was very rare to see an elf in the city, and now one was being sold as a slave at an auction. Not only was she beautiful, but the merchant also presented that she was skilled in archery, could use magic, and could even read and write in the elven language. Whether the buyer was a noble, a wealthy merchant, or a hero, the chance to encounter an elf like this was extremely rare. The merchant opened the bidding at 20 million rubes, and Harold was stunned to see people scrambling to place bids with numbers he had never possessed in his entire life. In the end, the auction closed with a price of 633 million rubes, the winner being an ugly man in armor. Harold was astonished by the amount of money the bidders were willing to spend just to buy a slave. He realized that no matter how beautiful and rare this elf was, these bidders were on a completely different level of wealth. The auction continued, and after hearing the huge numbers being called out, Harold started to feel dizzy. Then, the merchant announced that the final slave of the night was a dark elf. The reaction from the bidders clearly showed they wanted nothing to do with her. As buying a dark elf could mean bringing danger upon oneself, the merchant was surprised when no one placed a bid for this dark elf. Meanwhile, Harold noted that this was a completely different situation compared to the regular elf, though he could understand the bidders' reactions, as society rumored that dark elves brought misfortune to all who came into contact with them. This idea was deeply ingrained in popular belief through fairy tales and lessons taught to children. In fact, there was a famous story about a dark elf who came to sow trouble and bad luck for naughty children. Dark elves were even rarer than regular elves, so Harold believed that most of the people there didn't even know what they were really like. There was even a rumor about a family that once got involved with a dark elf, after which they went bankrupt and were eventually killed in despair. In an attempt to generate interest, the merchant began to present that this dark elf was only 15 years old, had extensive knowledge of magic, and had explored the labyrinth a few times. He also emphasized that she could serve as a bodyguard or a companion on quests, and was especially good at housework. The merchant also emphasized that she was still a virgin, and that the highest bidder would have the privilege of being her first. In this country, the elf race is considered filthy and wicked, but in other places, there are even regions where dark elves are known as virgins who bring good fortune. Harold now understood why they had saved her for the finale. They thought everyone would go wild for her, but since they were from another continent, they had underestimated the deep-seated prejudice the residents of the Northeast held against dark elves. The merchant realized this was about to be a failed auction for the dark elf, so he decided to start the bidding for her at 150,000 rubes. Harold was surprised to find that he hadn't walked out of the auction yet. Perhaps it was due to the merchant's pride. But even at the starting price, not a single person stood up to bid. However, this amount was just right for Harold, so after a few seconds of thought, he raised his hand, indicating that he would buy the dark elf for 150,000 rubes. The other bidders were astonished to see someone willing to buy a dark elf, who were rumored to bring misfortune. To be honest, Harold had never intended to spend anything, but by sheer coincidence, the asking price was the exact amount of money he had on him. In any case, Harold had no prejudice against dark elves and wasn't one to believe nasty rumors about people he'd never met. And besides, even if the rumors were true, his life was already so miserable he had nothing left to lose. After Harold made his bid, no one else competed, so the dark elf was sold to him for that price. A short while later, after the auction had ended, the merchant informed Harold that he'd gotten a fantastic deal. On the Western continent, he had sold dark elves for the equivalent of 1.6 billion rubes. Harold was so shocked he immediately spat out his drink and asked the merchant if he was going to cancel the transaction. The merchant replied that he would not. He explained that trust is crucial in business, and if people always doubted whether he would back out of a deal, he wouldn't have been able to stay in business. After that, it was time for the slave to be handed over. Harold was instructed to place a drop of his blood onto the collar and have her put it on. Harold looked confused, so the merchant explained that this was necessary for the collar to recognize him as her master. This was a subjugation collar, designed to shoot out sharp spikes if the wearer tried to kill their master, the one whose blood it had accepted. The merchant also stressed that no one could remove the collar except for her master. Without hesitation, Harold slowly. After he finished, it occurred to Harold that he'd never asked for her name. The girl then introduced herself as Atai. After this introduction, they looked at each other for a moment. Harold then asked her if something was wrong. She immediately got flustered and thanked him, because from what she just observed, it seemed her master was a good person. Although he'd lost everything when his house burned down, Harold now had a beautiful, dark elf female slave. A short while later, Harold and Ati were walking through the town square. Suddenly, Ati saw a regular elf pass by and immediately became uncomfortable. Harold noticed this and quickly asked what was wrong. She explained that dark elves don't get along well with regular elves. Harold understood this wasn't a personal issue between them, but rather a matter of her race. Even so, Harold started thinking about his next move. He thought it would be great if they could go home, but then he was painfully reminded that he no longer had a home to return to. A moment later, Harold explained to Adi that they couldn't go back to his house since it had burned down, and they couldn't stay at an inn either, because he'd spent all his remaining money to buy her. However, he reassured her not to worry because he had a plan. There was an unused hut at the foot of the mountain, so he figured it would be a suitable place for them to spend the night, and Ati agreed. Harold looked at Adi's outfit and realized she was dressed very simply. He thought he needed to buy her some new clothes, but since he was completely broke at the moment, he couldn't do it right away. Still, he promised he would do something about it for her soon. Harold found it strange that just a few hours ago, he had felt depressed and wanted to give up after losing his home. But now he was starting to get back on his feet. Then, he told Ati to let him know if she needed anything else. Adi replied that she might need some weapons and armor. Hearing this, Harold was very surprised and wondered why she would need such things. Ati, considering that Harold was short on money, suggested that they could go into the dungeon together. She then said that even without going too deep into it, they could still make some money. Adi had experience with dungeons before. However, she might need a little time to get used to a new one, but that didn't mean they wouldn't be able to earn anything at all. When Harold heard this, he recalled the slave trader's words that Ati had considerable knowledge of magic and had also explored a few dungeons. Ati continued, saying that since dark elves were clearly not well liked in the city, she figured it might be difficult to find a normal job. To prove her strength, Adi threw a stone into the air with great force. At first, Harold didn't understand the purpose of this action, but a few seconds later, a bird fell dead to the ground. Ati looked a little embarrassed and said that she'd only managed to kill one bird, and if she had a bow or a gun, she could have shot down 3 at once. After that, Harold started to think about how, in addition to her combat skills, Adi also had considerable knowledge of magic. This made him think that the two of them could actually make a good living exploring dungeons. Before long, Harold suggested they should start preparing as soon as possible, but he also reminded Ati that no matter how confident she was, the dungeon was still a very dangerous place. He told her that if she ever felt it wasn't right, she could turn back at any time, because the most important thing was for them to return safely. Adi replied that she would definitely be careful, and that she didn't want to die either. She added that she would do everything she could to protect Harold, with a radiant smile on her face. This made Harold blush as he realized it was the first time he'd ever seen her smile. A moment later, he remembered her saying she would try to protect him, and silently hoped that this didn't mean he had to go into the dungeon with her too. A few hours later, they arrived at the cabin Harold had mentioned earlier. For an unused place, Ati was surprised to see the cabin was quite decent. He then explained to her that he used to stop by this place to do repairs, and that it was very convenient for when he went gathering wild plants and herbs. Ati then offered to take care of preparing their meal, and after she was done, Harold noticed she was exhausted and lying on the bed, curled up like a child. Harold approached her, but she immediately sensed his presence and woke up. He reassured her not to worry, that she could sleep comfortably because he wouldn't do anything strange while she was sleeping. After a few minutes, Harold realized Ati had fallen asleep again, but he wondered if she was only pretending, fearing he might attack her since she was a slave. Harold figured she was probably aware of what could happen, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. A short while later, the sound of heavy booming footsteps was so loud it woke Ati from her sleep. Harold stepped outside and saw a troop of Imperial Knights on the march. He was confused as to why they were heading east. Harold didn't really have a grasp on the continent's political situation, but the sight made him wonder if a major conflict was on the horizon. Shortly after, Attie admitted she felt a little anxious about the situation. Harold suggested they should leave and head to another continent. She worriedly asked how he would get enough money for the trip since Harold was completely broke. Harold confidently said he would earn enough for their journey. He asked Attie if there was anywhere specific she wanted to go, and she replied that she wanted to go to the southwestern corner of the southern continent. Harold immediately agreed that would be their next destination. However, Harold suddenly remembered that the southern continent was notoriously expensive. Even boarding a ship cost a fortune, but since Attie would be earning money in the labyrinth, he figured it made more sense for him to join her. The only problem was that he only knew how to use a spear, a skill his father had taught him. Attie wondered why Harold didn't ask her reason for wanting to go there, and he replied that now that she mentioned it, he was starting to get curious. Meanwhile, despite his desperation, Harold had just lost his job and needed to earn some money to enter the labyrinth and make a living. He would have to ask his old boss to take him back and hope he wouldn't get an earful. When he arrived at the shop, it only took one look for Harold to think his boss was definitely furious. But contrary to his expectations, his boss was overjoyed at Harold's return. He even added that after Harold hadn't shown up for a while, he got curious and went to his house to check on him. When he got there, he saw Harold's house had been burned to the ground and even thought Harold had died in the fire. In short, Harold's boss was simply relieved that he was still alive. Harold then sat down and explained his current situation. After a brief chat, his boss understood that Harold needed to get some money together to enter the labyrinth. However, he was still curious why Harold wanted to go to the southern continent. Harold didn't want to share the details and just said he needed to get there urgently. Harold's boss understood and told him to wait a moment while he went to get something. A few minutes later, he returned with an envelope full of cash and explained that he had originally intended to give this money to Harold when he struck out on his own. As there's a saying that a master often gives a gift to his apprentice when sending them off with goodwill. But Harold reminded him that he'd never received any goodwill from his boss. Though he knew this was true, Harold's boss said he had been saving this money, originally planning to give it to Harold. And since he would be leaving soon, he thought now was a good time to hand it over. He also admitted that Harold had worked very hard for the past 15 years, and although he didn't think the amount was much, he said Harold should consider it his retirement pay. Upon hearing this, Harold was incredibly grateful and thanked his boss for everything he had done for him over the years. A few hours later, Harold returned to the abandoned cabin after a hunting trip, where he was immediately greeted by Attie, who had prepared him a feast fit for a king. Harold thanked Attie for the meal and then announced that he had some money now, so they would be going into town to buy some gear. He gave her a wide-brimmed white hat, intending for it to hide her long ears, which were the subject of much prejudice. Harold noticed Attie was silent after receiving the gift, so he asked if she would prefer a different kind of hat. Attie reassured him that she was perfectly happy with this one. The next day, they went to a weapon shop, where Harold asked Attie what kind of weapon she felt most comfortable using. She replied that it was a difficult choice because every weapon has its own pros and cons. After careful consideration, she decided on a sniper rifle. The shopkeeper then announced that the rifle cost 50,000 rubes. Hearing the price, Harold asked if she wanted him to buy her a more expensive one, but she replied that this rifle was perfectly fine for her. However, Attie went on, saying that what she really wanted was a single-shot rifle. If she could get a special bow like the famous demon bow, its power would far surpass that of a regular gun. However, the demon bow cost around 6.8 million rubes, and she knew Harold couldn't afford such a large sum. The advantage of the gun was that, while not expensive, it still had decent destructive power and penetration. Guns still need ammunition, of course, but it would be economical as long as she didn't waste shots. The downsides of a gun were its loud noise and being harder to aim than a bow, but you could still attach parts to reduce the noise. Aiming wasn't a big issue for Attie either. At this point, Harold noticed Attie was talking more than usual. She clearly had a passion for bows and guns. When talking about things she loved, she became quite chatty. A moment later, Harold said he would buy the rifle along with a suppressor for Ati, which made her very happy. With their purchase made, Ati was now ready for battle in the labyrinth, and as her master, she realized Harold also needed some gear for himself. However, Harold replied that he was perfectly fine with the bare minimum and also thought it was best to equip the most experienced person first. He then mentioned he would buy his own gear when he had enough money, which Ati understood. Harold thought for a moment and realized just how poorly equipped he was. Just a single glance was enough to see that his short spear was of very poor quality. But the cheapness of the weapon didn't matter to him. What mattered was its effectiveness. He considered his spear a one-time use weapon, because if he used even half his strength, it would definitely break. With their preparations complete and no more obstacles in their way, they decided to head towards their main objective, which was to make money in the labyrinth. Harold briefly explained its history. The labyrinth was established mainly because managing the proliferation of monsters was linked to the peace of the region. It accepted many types of people to explore it, which was the main reason hunters were allowed to keep monster materials from inside. The purpose of this was to prevent the labyrinth from being overrun with monsters. After hearing all this, Harold had a better understanding of the labyrinth and found himself wishing his father had told him more about it when he was a child. But all his father ever told him was that he didn't have much talent, which made Harold think he was hopeless when it came to the labyrinth or anything related to combat. Apparently, Harold's late father had been a professional labyrinth hunter. Harold knew that his father was highly respected in his field and was also very skilled. But one day, 15 years ago, he entered the labyrinth and never came back. The fact that he never returned led Harold to believe his father was dead. His father's goal had been to find the labyrinth's final location, which lay deep beneath the lowest floor. This wasn't a wise decision, considering he went in with only a spear, which isn't very effective in tight spaces. Harold lost his mother to illness when he was a child, and after his father disappeared, he became an orphan and had to fend for himself. This experience made Harold cautious, and he warned Ati that even though she was very confident in her abilities, the labyrinth was still extremely dangerous. He reminded her that if she encountered a life-threatening situation, she should retreat immediately. The next day, Harold and Ati arrived at the labyrinth and noticed that many adventurers were gathered there. As they approached the labyrinth's gate, they were stopped by a man in armor. Judging by the way he was dressed, Harold easily guessed that he was the guard in charge of the labyrinth. After a moment, Harold asked the guard if there was any entrance fee. The guard replied that it cost nothing to enter the labyrinth. But at the same time, he mentioned a problem he had been warning adventurers about. Harold and Ati looked confused, so the guard explained that recently there had been reports of a few monsters from the deeper floors appearing on the upper levels. Although the knights had formed a search party, it yielded no results. And since no one had witnessed the monsters for a while, the search had been suspended. At the end of his explanation, the guard warned that it was possible those monsters were still lurking in the labyrinth. So he urged them both to be extremely careful. Harold then asked Ati what she thought about this. She replied that it wasn't impossible for a few monsters from the lower floors to appear, but there were also many cases of false reports, so it was hard to be certain. But since there was still a possibility of monsters appearing, Ati thought they should both be cautious and stay vigilant. As they continued deeper into the labyrinth, they happened to encounter another group of adventurers. The leader of this group took one look at Harold and remarked that entering the labyrinth with such shoddy equipment was nothing short of suicide. He even sneered at Harold's old spear. The group leader sarcastically mused that Harold probably admired Edwin Smith, a legendary labyrinth conqueror. As soon as he heard that name, Harold immediately realized it was his father's. However, Harold had never thought that his father was a labyrinth conqueror and a legendary hero. Meanwhile, the leader saw Ati and said that she looked quite pretty, and on top of that, was completely stacked. He tried to touch her, but Harold reacted instantly, telling him to back off while pointing the tip of his spear directly at the man's throat. Maintaining his strong fighting stance, Harold declared that the guy was not to look at or touch his woman again, or it would be the end of him. After this confrontation, the remaining adventurers were stunned by Harold's strength and agility, even though they had thought he looked weak and small. Harold, however, found it strange that they were so surprised, as they should have noticed this sooner. In the tense atmosphere, the leader, with beads of sweat on his face, asked Harold to relax and said that he was just joking. Meanwhile, Harold turned to look at Ati and noticed she had a rather strange expression. He hoped she wasn't angry with him. Right after that, Harold lowered his spear and said he didn't have time to deal with pathetic lowlifes like them, then suggested they get going. After Harold left, the group of adventurers was still in shock from his lightning-fast attack. They had seen Harold as a rookie, but from the way he struck, they all knew very well not to mess with him if they didn't want trouble. A few minutes later, Harold and Ati reached the labyrinth, where they observed the glowing walls and floors, which was known as Labyrinth Light. Just then, with a blushing face, Ati thanked Harold for standing up for her against those cowardly adventurers. She whispered that she was very surprised when Harold called her his woman, adding that she had always had a strong desire to be with him. Harold didn't quite hear what she said because she was whispering, but he simply replied that he was glad she was happy. While the two were still standing at the edge of the cave, Ati knelt on one knee and fired a shot from her sniper rifle, aiming deep into a dark corner of the cave. Ati didn't believe she would hit anything, but to her surprise, she cleanly shot a monster lizard. Harold was incredibly surprised since he couldn't even see anything in that darkness. Ati then said that it was just a small monster, and she explained that since birth, she had always had very good eyes and ears. Hearing this, Harold realized that he had always thought Ati was very talented, but her skills and abilities far exceeded his expectations. Harold then asked Ati if they could go deeper into the labyrinth, and she replied that she had only ever gone as deep as the middle floors, but couldn't go any further alone. Harold immediately understood that this meant she used to have companions in the past, and Ati confirmed it. She continued to explain that when she was on the Western continent, she had joined an all-female labyrinth exploration party, where she stayed for a while. But before she could continue her story, Harold noticed she was hesitating, so he reassured her that she didn't have to tell him if she didn't want to. Ati then replied that it was a very kind thought from him, but she thought this was a good opportunity to tell Harold about her past. She began to briefly explain what had happened. Apparently, the leader of the party had fallen in love with a man, and she'd given him a large portion of the group's profits. One day, Ati was drugged, and when she woke up, she discovered she'd been sold to a slave trader. Ati wasn't entirely sure, but she suspected that her own leader had sold her, since being a virgin female dark elf was rare and could fetch a high price. After hearing this story, Harold felt sympathy for Ati and said her leader was a terrible person for doing that. However, Ati saw a silver lining in all of this. She reasoned that if her leader hadn't fallen for that man and sold her, she wouldn't have been able to become the slave of someone as good as Harold. She also said that if she had been sold to a cruel person, she would definitely resent her leader a great deal. Harold, despite not thinking he had done anything particularly special as a master, was incredibly surprised to hear her say that. However, from Ati's words, Harold made a promise to himself that he would do his best to be a good master to her. At the same time, he realized that he now understood her feelings better. Meanwhile, Ati was lost in thought and realized that she had truly fallen in love with Harold. At this point, she would probably do anything for him, just as her former leader once did. A few minutes later, Ati continued using her sniper rifle to take out a few more cave rats, model. Then Harold would process the fur. After repeating this several times, Harold suggested they should head back home. On their way back, they saw a giant door up ahead, and both assumed there might be treasure inside. Harold, being the curious one, proposed that they stop to check what was behind the door. Before entering, Ati used her magic to create a few butterflies. Harold was surprised to see she could do that, and then noticed that some of the butterflies seemed to stop at random points, which confused him. Addie explained that these were magical butterflies she created. They are drawn to places where they can sense malice, which is why some of them stopped at certain spots. Those are the trapped areas. Addie also added that she had many other spells, but none of them could be used directly in combat. Just then, one of her butterflies landed right in front of them, indicating that there were still a few traps ahead. But on the bright side, there was probably some treasure left. Addie explained to Harold that no one had ever passed through the area they were in, but since there were many adventurers on the upper floors, it was likely that this treasure had appeared recently. Harold didn't quite understand what she meant by appeared recently. So Addie further explained that it's rumored the dungeon has a will of its own. After a treasure is taken, the dungeon will partially collapse after a certain number of days, and over time, it will move the treasure to a different location, resetting the traps as well. After Harold heard and understood this, he added that there were rumors the dungeon also creates monsters. A few minutes later, they reached a room where they saw a very beautiful dagger in the center. However, Addie's danger-sensing butterflies landed on it. So she assumed the dagger was likely cursed, something very rare on the upper floors of the dungeon. Harold didn't know much about the dungeon, so he wanted Atia's opinion on what to do next. She replied that if the curse only had negative effects, they couldn't use the dagger themselves, and no one would buy it, even if they tried to sell it. However, they could try to identify the type of curse in the area using spells or magic, or alternatively, by using special magic tools. Harold decided to leave it for now, and wait until they had the necessary tools to identify the curse. A few seconds later, Harold asked if these magic tools were expensive. Addie replied that they were indeed very expensive, costing as much as a whole house. Hearing this, Harold could hardly believe it, as he knew it had taken 15 years of saving to build his old house. Addie continued, saying that if they could earn a steady income from the lower floors of the dungeon, they'd be able to make enough for the magic tools in about a month. And if they were lucky, they could earn that amount in a single expedition. However, Harold told Atia that if they ended up not being able to afford the magic tools, she shouldn't worry about it anymore and should just relax and earn money safely, since their goal was only to make money for their journey. Ati smiled and agreed with him. As they continued through the dungeon, they came across a large crowd and decided to see what was going on. Harold looked into the center of the crowd and realized the man there was the one who had won the elf slave auction. He was the third son of a count. The crowd confirmed that the rumors about him bragging while exploring the dungeon were true. Right now, he was boasting about the new elf slave he had just bought. Harold felt annoyed seeing her being treated so poorly. He wondered why the elf girl didn't do anything to fight back. Ati explained that the slave collar wouldn't allow the elf to harm her master in any way. The man considered the elf slave a great achievement because she was beautiful, could use magic, and was not only useful in the dungeon, but could also entertain him in the bedroom. Seeing the look on Adi's face, Harold knew she felt great pity for the other elf. He told Adi she didn't have to look if it was upsetting her. After a moment, Harold suggested they should get going. A few hours later, they had left the crowd and continued on their journey. They arrived at the Nepal Trading Company, where Harold told Ati that when he worked for his master, the silversmith, he often did business with this company. It was famous for buying any and all materials you could gather from the dungeon. Once inside, Harold was greeted by a man named Tosu. From the way they spoke, it was clear that the two were very familiar with each other. Harold then told Tosu that he wanted to sell a beast pelt he had acquired from the dungeon. Tosu was surprised and said he was shocked that Harold had switched from being a silversmith to a dungeon explorer. Harold explained that he needed money to travel to the southern continent. Seeing the urgency of the situation, Tosu decided not to ask too many questions to avoid wasting time. Tosu inspected it and said that the beast pelt Harold brought in was the fur of a migranti, valued at 15,000 rubes per piece, for a total of 12,000 rubes. Harold was very surprised by this amount, knowing that his daily wage at his master's place was only about 7,000 rubes. This income from exploring the dungeon was nearly double that. Harold realized he would be able to save up a lot more money sooner than he expected. He then asked Tosu about the cost to get to the southern continent, and Tosu replied that it would cost about 3 million rubes for both of them to travel via the western continent. And if they wanted to go directly to the southern continent, it would cost about 10 million rubes for the two of them. The reason the direct route to the southern continent was so expensive was because it passed through an isolated area where monsters from an undersea dungeon were active. However, going via the western continent would be cheaper and safer. Harold always prioritized safety, so he decided they would take the route through the western continent. He also figured that if they could earn about 2 million more rubes, they would be fine. The initial cost was estimated at about 5 million rubes, so Harold now had a clear idea of what they needed. The two of them then continued killing monsters in the dungeon. And a week later, after returning to the trading post, they realized they had earned over 170,000 rubes in just that week. After deducting their living expenses, they had 120,000 rubes left. Harold then said he wanted to start hunting monsters on the middle floors soon, to which Ati agreed. Therefore, he declared that the next day, they would start exploring the middle floors. However, at that moment, he had no idea what they were about to face. The next day, they finally entered the middle floors, and Harold felt anxious about all the monsters they would encounter. At first, Ati was leading the way, but she suddenly stopped, prompting Harold to immediately ask what was wrong. She replied that she didn't like the atmosphere in that cave. Harold was a bit confused as to why she felt that way, and almost started to assume they might be lost. Ati replied that wasn't it, but she had sensed something very large approaching. Just then, they both heard a loud noise, and Ati immediately suggested they run and find a place to hide. A few moments later, Harold was stunned to see a giant monster emerge from a narrow hole in the cave. At the same time, Ati was also terrified but tried to stay calm. Looking at the monster's nature, Ati could tell it was a dangerous earth dragon from the lower levels. Harold was surprised to hear that an earth dragon was on a lower floor. Right then, Ati apologized to Harold, saying she couldn't even scratch the monster with a normal bullet, which showed just how tough its skin was. And Harold, not wanting to risk death, suggested to Ati that they should just head home. But just as they were about to leave, they both heard a voice crying for help. At the same time, the voice was rapidly approaching them. A moment later, the owner of that panicked voice turned out to be the man they had seen earlier, the one who had mistreated his elf slave. Ignoring that, he ran towards them, shouting that a high-level monster had appeared and he needed help. When he reached Atiye and Harold, he immediately fell to his knees and explained that he was part of a 4-person group. When his comrades saw the dragon, they hid in a narrow crevice, but after a while, the monster discovered them. Right now, the dragon is still waiting outside for his comrades to leave their hiding spot. After hearing his story, Harold started to remember meeting this man somewhere before. Just a few seconds later, his 2 brain cells fired up, and Harold realized this was the same guy who had threatened 80. Harold thought that it was too late to go back and call for help, and he wasn't even sure if anyone was strong enough to defeat that monster dragon. After weighing the situation, Harold realized it was completely absurd to go fight that monster alone. But just as he was about to refuse the plea, the man started crying again, saying that some of his comrades had children, and if they died, their kids' lives would become miserable. This reminded Harold of how his own father had entered the labyrinth and never returned. Harold realized that if he refused to help, those men's children would face the same miserable fate he had. He clenched his fists, his eyes serious, and then asked the man where his comrades were hiding. This implicitly showed that Harold had decided to help. Right after, Adi asked about the current situation. Harold took a deep breath and explained that he'd heard there were children at risk of losing their fathers, and he couldn't just stand by without doing his best to help in the situation. Adi suggested Harold use her secret weapon, but before she could finish her sentence, Harold transformed into a superhuman for a few seconds and rushed off to rescue the adventurers. Feeling uneasy, Adi yelled his name to stop him, but it was no use. Harold ran for a while until he reached the buried wall where the dragon was waiting. He saw the four men hiding in a hole opposite the monster, while the dragon just sat there, waiting for them to come out. Harold thought that since there was only one monster, defeating it would be easy. He could sense the dragon's complacency and arrogance, which was probably why it hadn't noticed him. Because of that, Harold believed he could win. He prepared to attack, tensing every nerve and muscle. As he was gathering an enormous amount of energy from another dimension, this powerful energy tore at every inch of his flesh. He channeled all of this power into his short spear and attacked the monster. However, the power he was using wasn't magic, but a violent torrent of energy, something that shouldn't be manifested in this world. And in particular, the price for using this power was extremely high. Meanwhile, after Harold had defeated the monster with his mysterious power, he was lying face down on the ground. A moment later, Adi rushed over to him. She immediately touched him to check his condition. Harold opened his eyes, unsure of where he was, but replied that he was fine, just a little dizzy. Even so, he added that he didn't think there would be any serious after effects from the battle. Ati was very worried about his health, especially after seeing him collapse with blood on his face. She made Harold promise her he would be more careful in similar situations next time, and he agreed with a smile on his face. Afterward, the adventurers whose lives Harold had saved came to thank him for risking his life to save them. They saw him as their savior, because in that moment, they had believed they would never see their children again and thought they were going to die. Harold could feel their sincerity and humbly accepted their thanks. After defeating the monster, Harold wanted to take a part of its body back to sell, but he knew that dissecting the dragon's corpse would be very difficult, especially since its skin was so tough. After Harold said this, A.T. remarked that the earth dragon was an extremely powerful monster, and its outer skin was made of dragon metal. Even though dismantling the monster's corpse was difficult, she still wondered how someone as small and useless as Harold could have made a hole in the earth dragon's body. Harold then explained to Ati that he had used a special skill called Scorching Piercing Lance, but he always lost consciousness whenever he used it, so he couldn't use it often. Ati remembered the terrifying moment she saw Harold unconscious, so she begged him not to use that skill anymore. Harold replied that he would do his best not to use it. Not long after, the adventurers Harold had saved offered to help him carry the monster's corpse back. They felt they owed him their lives, so it was the least they could do to repay him. Harold accepted their offer with a smile. Meanwhile, Harold wondered how much a deep floor monster would be worth. A few hours later, he arrived at the trading shop, where the receptionist informed him that the materials he brought back were worth up to 13 million rubes. The moment he heard that amount, Harold nearly had a heart attack, cold sweat running down his face. He realized why the labyrinth attracted so many people. The receptionist then informed him that since the amount Harold was receiving exceeded 10 million rubes, he needed to fill out his banking information. As he did so, Harold thought that it had been a long time since he'd used that fighting technique, and it had taken a toll on his body. But in the end, the pain and injuries were worth it. 2 days later, Harold was stunned to see that 13 million rubes had actually been deposited into his account. He still couldn't believe it, but he quickly realized that he and Ati now had enough money to travel to the Western continent. After successfully withdrawing the money, he returned to the tent, bringing back a peach pie that Ati had been craving. He said he bought it as a gift for Ati, since he had asked her to stay home. Ati thanked Harold and immediately took a bite of the peach pie. She remarked on how delicious it was. Afterward, Harold announced that they had saved enough money and they would set off for the port city the next day. The next day, they reached the edge of town, where they were shown the carriage that would take them to the port city. From there, they would take a ship to the southern continent as they both boarded the carriage and began their journey. Harold, having fought his way from losing his home in a fire to taking down an earth dragon, admitted to himself that he never expected to find himself in such situations. He realized he was lost in his own thoughts and didn't want Atai to know he was worried. He quickly asked Atie if she had ever been to the Western continent. Atie replied that she didn't think it was a bad place, and although there were many different races, which often led to conflict, that very diversity gave it a unique charm. Harold then told her he needed her help to guide him around the southern continent, as she was familiar with the area. This filled Ati with joy, as she felt genuinely needed by Harold. Just then, a beautiful girl with a sword and her grandfather appeared, both patiently waiting for the carriage that would take them to the port. After a short wait, they saw the Cat 1 carriage that would take them to their destination, and somehow, it was the very same one Harold and Ati had boarded. Stepping inside, Harold was surprised to see two strangers in the carriage. The girl's grandfather immediately asked Harold who he was, and then began to closely observe his facial features and behavior, suspecting Harold might be the son of someone he once knew. Instantly, his granddaughter slapped him across the face to punish him for his rude behavior towards a stranger he had never met before. She then introduced her grandfather to Harold as Varen Myers and introduced herself as Cecil. Then Varen mentioned his father's name, Gurgo, and as soon as Harold heard it, the name sounded very familiar, making him wonder where he had heard it before. Before Varen could say anything more, Cecil told him to be quiet, then bowed her head and apologized to Harold for her grandfather's rude behavior. Varen understood that his previous behavior had greatly embarrassed Cecil, so he also apologized to Harold. Right after, Varen mentioned that he and Cecil were on their way to the Western continent, and Harold replied that he was also heading in that direction. They acknowledged that they would be traveling companions for a short while, and the atmosphere turned cheerful, as it was clear they were looking forward to their time together. A few hours later, they arrived at the port city, where the two pairs of companions said their goodbyes. As they parted, Cecil mentioned that she and her grandfather would be boarding a ship called the Balestia, and if Harold and Ati hadn't decided on a ship yet, they might consider taking it. They then waved goodbye to each other. Harold then suggested that they should find a good ship to take them to their destination, adding that it would be better to find one that wasn't too expensive. A few minutes later, they arrived at the docks, where they were greeted by a bald merchant with an eye patch. This man informed Harold that there were many ships currently docked, so he had a good chance of finding a decent one. Harold understood this and asked the merchant about the ship named Balestia. The merchant replied that it was just an ordinary ship, nothing special. For Harold and Ati, the fare would be 2.8 million rubes, which included a small bedroom and 2 meals. However, the merchant noticed Harold was a thrifty person, so he informed him that it was possible to pay 200,000 rubes per person. But that would mean they would have to stay in a large room shared with about a dozen other people and would only be provided 1 meal. That room, however, would be very messy and filled with disease-ridden rodents. Moreover, the ship sometimes even sinks and has to be rescued. The merchant also informed them that the ships wouldn't be leaving for another week, so Harold and Ati could still come back once they had decided which ship to take. As the two walked, Harold considered that a luxury ship would cost up to 10 million rubes, and he also knew that if they searched for a fast ship, they would surely be disappointed with the food and living conditions on board. Harold decided that it would take a few days to think more carefully about choosing a ship, while also thinking it would be a good idea for them to find a place to stay and eat in the meantime. As the two were walking along the road, a stranger suddenly ran past them. Just a few seconds later, Harold realized his bag, containing their entire fortune of about 10 million rubes, had been stolen. But just then, a bullet hit the young thief in the leg, causing him to stumble to the ground. Harold immediately grabbed the kid by the collar, demanding his money bag back. It was at that moment Harold realized the bullet that had just hit the ground was from Adi's gun. To Harold's surprise, Adi said she only fired a warning shot and had no intention of harming anyone. But the kid still stole Harold's money. And even if he's a child, some things are just unacceptable. While Ati was scolding the boy, Harold noticed he had an unpleasant smell and was wearing tattered clothes. This led him to ask the obvious question: did the boy need the money? Ati, however, disagreed with giving the boy money after he had just tried to rob Harold. She continued to scold the boy even more harshly. Just then, a woman called out the boy's name, Matsudo, and asked what he thought he was doing. As it turned out, this was Matsudo's mother. And she rushed to apologize to Harold for her son's foolish actions, promising to scold him when they got home. But Harold reassured her that he had gotten his money back, so there was no need to punish the boy further. He also advised her to teach Matsudo proper moral lessons, so he wouldn't need to be fixed later. Matsudo's mother sighed and said that she always tried to teach him what was right, but he never listened. In an angry voice, Matsudo told his mother to be quiet and explained that he was stealing to earn money to help his father and pay off the family's debts. Having said that, the boy immediately took off like the wind, forcing his mother to hurriedly chase after him. After they were long gone, Harold and Ati realized that Matsudo's mother must have a lot on her plate, especially having to deal with such a mischievous child. However, this was a story that happens everywhere, so neither Harold nor Ati was too surprised. Afterward, Harold decided they needed to find a comfortable place to rest. Finally, they arrived at an inn and asked about vacant rooms. The receptionist replied that there were no more rooms for that day. They left and tried many other inns, but their efforts were unsuccessful. They had tried more than a dozen inns, but couldn't believe that there were no rooms left. When they had almost lost hope, they decided to try one more inn. This time, surprisingly, they had a vacant room, but it was just a small room with a double bed, which might be enough for 2 people. However, when they were led to the room, they were shocked because the room was so small. What was more surprising was that the receptionist had lied about there being a double bed. Harold started to wonder whether he should sleep on the floor or in the bathroom. He then said he wanted to take a bath, which surprised Ati, as he wasn't dirty at all and looked even cleaner than usual. But she just assumed he had been sweating without realizing it. Ati suddenly said that she also wanted to take a bath, because such a small room could make smells spread more easily, and she didn't want to fill the room with the smell of her fish oil. After saying that, Ati rushed into the bathroom. After they'd both finished bathing, Harold was seen walking down the hallway, and he happened to overhear a conversation between 2 gentlemen. One said that he'd been on the northeast continent and was about to go to a city called Tawakkul. He was traveling with his son and said they would arrive in Tawakkul in about 1 to 2 months. He also recalled that the last time he was there was more than 10 years ago, and the city was truly beautiful. His son was overjoyed to hear this and was very much looking forward to the trip. But he was still a little worried. The boy added that since they left the ship, he had heard some strange rumors that the situation in the empire was starting to become unstable. And if a war were to break out, there would most likely be checkpoints on the roads. As soon as Harold heard this, he remembered the checkpoints he had witnessed earlier. He also heard that many others had seen the same thing, meaning he wasn't the only one who found it strange. Anyway, Harold wasn't too concerned about matters of war because he was about to leave the continent. When he returned to the room, he hopped onto his surprisingly comfortable bed. After relaxing in the bath, he realized how tired he was from the long journey, and so Harold realized there was no reason to sleep on the floor, and that there was nothing wrong with them sharing a bed, because it was just a bed for them both to sleep in. Soon after Adi returned from the bathroom, she noticed Harold was already in bed and immediately thought he was fast asleep. She moved closer and playfully whispered in his ear, asking if he was asleep yet. But instantly, Harold suddenly shot up and grabbed Ati's hand tightly, which surprised her. However, Adi seemed to be the type who liked it rough, so she leaned against his chest. Harold was surprised that she didn't resist at all, but he quickly understood that, as a slave, she might not want to resist even if she could. Her action made Harold wonder what she thought of him, but he decided it was better not to know. Adi was still in the mood and told Harold that she always knew this day would come. She also confessed that she had never traveled with anyone before, so she wanted him to make this trip memorable for her. She was aware that she was a slave, but at the same time, she was also a woman. If they were about to be intimate, this would be Ati's first time experiencing it, and Harold would be her first. Just as the atmosphere was getting as sensual as it could be, Harold suddenly spoke up, saying he just wanted to discuss which ship they should take. This completely stunned Ati, and her eyes went wide with surprise. Harold continued, saying they still had a week before the ship was set to depart, but if they waited too long, the tickets would be sold out. After careful consideration, he decided that the ship Balestia was the best option. To Harold, this was an ordinary ship, and the price was also suitable for his budget of 3 million rubes. It wasn't too cheap, nor was it too expensive. He considered it a moderate choice. Although Adi's face didn't look very happy, she still agreed with Harold's decision. A moment later, Harold announced that they would go buy tickets for the trip tomorrow. Throughout the conversation about the ship, Harold noticed that Ati seemed unhappy. He wondered if something was wrong. Before he could ask further, Harold noticed Ati had lain down on the bed in frustration, so he decided to lie down next to her, holding her in his arms. Harold thought that holding Ati so tightly was his right as her master, and as he held her tightly, Ati was flustered, her face blushing. She secretly thought that if Harold was willing to go this far, then he should have also finished the job of harvesting the field she had prepared. She had been really looking forward to this moment, so she felt deeply disappointed when things didn't go as expected. The next morning, the two returned to the blindfolded merchant they had met the day before and announced that they had decided to board the Balestia. Upon hearing this, the merchant informed them that the trip would cost 2.8 million rubes. After Harold paid, the merchant gave them the tickets and reminded them that the ship would depart in exactly 5 days, at noon. They were also told that they could now go to their room on the ship and sleep there. But they had to make sure not to miss the ship as there would be no refunds. After leaving the merchant's shop, they quickly headed for the dock. When they stood before the Balestia, they were both stunned by its impressive and beautiful appearance. They proceeded to the entrance, where an attendant asked to check their tickets before allowing them to board. Harold handed over the tickets, and the attendant remarked that they had gotten a fantastic room with a great view and a lot of space. After being allowed on board, Harold and Ati immediately went to their room. When Harold opened the door, they were both surprised by how comfortable and cool the room was. Ati saw a window with a beautiful view, just as the attendant had said. Their room was below sea level, which meant they could easily see everything swimming around. Harold noticed Ati was completely captivated by the window, so he decided not to disturb her, and he began to walk around the ship alone with his spear in hand. While walking, he ran into Cecil. She was happy to see that Harold had also decided to take this ship. Harold replied that he really couldn't find any other ship that seemed as good as this one from the start. Harold didn't see Cecil with her grandfather, so he asked about him. Cecil replied that he was sleeping. Suddenly, Cecil suggested that since they were both on the same ship, they should go walk around the city together for a while. Harold found this suggestion a bit strange, as being on the same ship and touring the city seemed completely unrelated. But before he could think it over, Cecil had already grabbed his hand and pulled him along for a walk. Later, they arrived in the city, and the two walked around and watched as Cecil enjoyed a snack. She noticed Harold wasn't eating anything, so she offered to share her portion and said he could have all of it. However, Harold politely declined. After a moment of silence, Cecil shared that her grandfather had taken a strong liking to Harold. Although Harold wasn't sure about it, he realized they had talked quite a bit back in the carriage. Cecil replied, saying it was because her grandfather had taken a liking to Harold that they chatted so much. Her grandfather was a friendly person, but he didn't usually talk much to people he disliked. The way he spoke with Harold made it clear he didn't hate him. Suddenly, Cecil launched a surprise attack on Harold, but he easily blocked it with his spear, leaving Cecil utterly astonished, her eyes wide with shock. She was surprised that Harold hadn't dodged but had instead parried, which meant he had seen and reacted to her attack in time. With a smile on his face, Harold thought Cecil's attack was a bit reckless, but he also acknowledged that her strength was truly impressive. Harold then asked Cecil why she had attacked him so randomly. With a smile, Cecil answered that since her grandfather had taken an interest in him, she felt it was necessary to test his strength. Hearing this, Harold could only wonder what other crazy things this girl was capable of for such a strange reason. Cecil noticed that Harold was quite surprised by her attack, so she quickly reassured him that she just wanted to test his skills. Nothing more. She even promised not to do something like that again. Afterward, Cecil suggested they both return to the ship. However, after what had just happened, Harold doubted whether that was a good idea. So he proposed that they should go their separate ways. Cecil chuckled lightly and told Harold he didn't need to be so guarded. Just then, they were drawn by the screams of a young boy, as two ugly thugs were trying to drag him away. Upon seeing this, Harold immediately thought it was a kidnapping. But after a few seconds of a closer look, he realized the boy was the same child who had tried to steal his money pouch. Suddenly, Cecil dashed towards the boy, saying she couldn't ignore his situation and had to help. Harold was surprised to see Cecil act without any hesitation, and right after, he decided to run after her. Cecil noticed Harold was following her and asked if he intended to help. And Harold responded affirmatively. Cecil remarked that Harold's kind face suited his personality, which made her think he was truly a good person. After running for a while, they reached the shore and saw the kidnappers had boarded a boat with the boy. Harold ran to the water's edge to try and catch up. But unfortunately, he couldn't make it in time, and the kidnappers were slowly taking the boy further away. Without hesitation, Cecil jumped into a nearby boat and told Harold to get on with her. However, Harold was hesitant because it wasn't their boat. Noticing Harold's reluctance, Cecil assured him that she would return the boat when everything was over. She added that even if something happened to the boat, like it getting damaged, she would compensate the owner. Reassured, Harold agreed to get on the boat to save the boy. They rowed continuously until they reached an island, which appeared to be the hideout of the boy's kidnappers. Judging by the number of boats there, it was clear there were quite a few people. However, Cecil didn't care about that and vowed to make them regret it one way or another. But before she could rush into battle, Harold stopped her and suggested they observe their surroundings carefully first. Cecil replied that there was no need to be so cautious, especially when they were both very strong, which meant there was no chance they would lose this fight. After hearing Cecil's words, Harold began to wonder where she got that confidence from. Just then, Harold turned and saw a strange boat floating across the water. But in a flash, it was gone. He didn't want to believe he was going crazy, so he told himself he had probably just seen some fishermen. Harold dismissed the thought. Soon after, he and Cecil began to scout around the island. They quickly realized all they needed to do was find where the bad guys were hiding on the island. They both hid in the bushes to avoid being seen. Harold was in a perfect hiding spot, but Cecil was wandering around. A moment later, Harold grabbed Cecil by the collar and advised her not to act so recklessly, or they wouldn't find anything. He pointed ahead to show her there were footprints on the trampled grass, and furthermore, the dirt on them hadn't dried yet. This indicated that someone had just passed through here, and not long ago. They both followed the footprints to a wooden door, which was likely where the kidnappers were hiding. Suddenly, a heavy rain began to pour down. Cecil felt the raindrops and quickly ran toward the door, trying to get inside to escape the rain. But just before she could enter, Harold pulled her back by her cloak and told her not to be foolish. He explained that barging in like that would be a bad idea, as the kidnappers would notice their presence the moment they entered through the main door. However, Cecil disagreed and proposed that they simply kill anyone who got in their way. After a few minutes, they snuck into the building through an open window. Harold then suggested they hide in some wooden barrels to think about their next move. However, Cecil thought being so cautious was ridiculous and saw no point in it. She thought it was better to just eliminate anyone who stood in their way. This philosophy stemmed from her belief that no one there was stronger than them. Harold, on the other hand, felt there was still a chance of encountering someone stronger, so it was best to avoid confrontation. Their main objective was to rescue the boy, so they should only fight when absolutely necessary. Harold's wise words finally convinced Cecil. She agreed to be more cautious on this mission, and even remarked that Harold sounded like her grandfather when he spoke. Just then, Harold and Cecil realized some people were approaching. They both tried to stay silent and not reveal their presence. They then overheard the men discussing the boy's fate. It seemed the boy had tried to steal their goods, and for that, he had to pay the price. One of them suggested handing the boy over to the boss, and another agreed, as they all knew the boss was extremely cruel to children. The whole group was looking forward to the sight of the boy crying as he was punished. From what Harold could hear, it seemed the boy had tried to steal from them, but only half of the group had run away. Just then, one of the kidnappers saw the spear sticking out from the wooden barrel. At first, he wondered whose spear it was and was about to move it to tidy up. But just as he was about to touch the spear, an accomplice stopped him, saying he shouldn't touch someone else's weapon if he didn't know who the owner was. The group agreed and decided to leave it alone. After the kidnappers left, Harold and Cecil immediately got out of the barrel and began searching for the boy. While moving around the house, they stumbled upon a strange egg placed on a luxurious silk pillow. They stared at the egg for a moment and discovered it was starting to move on its own. Finally, the egg cracked open, and a small snake popped out of the shell, then slithered straight into Cecil's clothes. Immediately after, Cecil started screaming and jumping in panic, making a loud noise that accidentally alerted the kidnappers to an intruder. Harold knew the situation was getting bad, so he quickly covered Cecil's mouth with his hand and hid her in a nearby closet. When the kidnappers came into the room to check for intruders, they were surprised to find it completely empty, with no signs of theft or disturbance. However, they quickly noticed the egg was broken, which made them wonder if it had hatched and if the sound they heard earlier was from the creature inside. The kidnappers believed the sound was caused by something from the egg and started to wonder where it had hidden. They were also very worried. As the egg was a precious item their boss had brought back from a special place, if they couldn't find the creature, they would be in big trouble. Meanwhile, Cecil was still struggling as the little snake in her shirt wouldn't stop squirming. It was rolling all over the place, even making her cry out a few times in discomfort. Seeing the situation getting more dangerous, Harold had no choice but to slide his hand into Cecil's bra to try and catch the snake. Cecil immediately started squirming as Harold searched inside her bra for the snake. She let out a loud moan, and Harold replied that he had no other choice. A moment later, the snake seemed to get bored of being there, so it decided to move to Cecil's lower half. In response, Harold once again reached into her lower regions, trying to catch it. Less than a minute later, after a long search, Harold got a hold of the snake and successfully pulled it out. After it was all over, Cecil thanked Harold for his help and apologized for causing so much trouble. Meanwhile, the kidnappers were still frantically searching for the snake that had hatched from the egg. But all their efforts were in vain. In the end, they decided to give up, thinking their boss had probably forgotten about the snake in the first place. They figured they could just find it after they sold all their goods. After the kidnappers left, Harold and Cecil stepped out of the closet. While they were in there, the space was so cramped that Harold had to hold Cecil tightly just to fit. However, after they got out, Harold continued to hold her tight. Cecil asked him how much longer he was going to hug her, and he quickly apologized. With a blushing face, Cecil replied that Harold didn't need to apologize because she wasn't really mad. Harold then turned his attention to the snake he had hatched from the egg, holding it in his hand. He remembered the kidnappers saying they would sell the snake if they found it. However, this snake didn't look like any ordinary snake. Harold stared at it for a moment, and the snake stared back at him with the same intensity. Harold then asked the snake if it could understand human language. After he spoke, the snake nodded its head vigorously to confirm. With that, Harold was able to confirm that it understood speech. He then asked the snake if it wanted to come with them. Harold figured that if the snake understood them, it wouldn't cause any trouble, and it seemed like a good idea. Cecil agreed, but said she still felt a little scared after what she'd been through with the snake. Harold smiled and said that the situation with Cecil was exactly what made him interested in the little snake. Right after that, they continued on their way. After dodging the guards for a while, they finally reached the top floor and saw a huge door in front of them. It seemed to be the only place they hadn't checked yet. But just before entering the room, they heard a strange noise coming from a woman behind the large door. Harold heard muffled screams and immediately assumed it was the kidnapped child, which meant their plan for a silent rescue was no longer an option. Realizing this, Cecil asked Harold what the new plan was. He thought for a moment and came up with a new idea, though he hesitated, feeling uncomfortable with it. But then Harold realized they had no choice but to break down the door by force. He informed Cecil that they would split roles. She was to rush in and get the boy as soon as they broke into the room. Harold explained that breaking down the door would definitely attract attention, and it was highly likely the villain's minions would attack them immediately. If that happened, Harold wouldn't be able to focus on fighting the villain if the child was still in danger. So, when they charged in, Harold wanted Cecil to grab the boy and get out of there as fast as possible. Cecil thought the plan was ridiculous and that being so cautious was unnecessary. She thought that beating all the bad guys from the start would be a much better option. When it came to fighting, she was confident she was the stronger of the two, and wondered why she had to be the one to run away. To convince Cecil, Harold looked at her with a captivating gaze and earnestly begged her to follow his plan. Mesmerized by his eyes, Cecil finally agreed. Just a few minutes later, they kicked the door down and were shocked to see a giant spider person sitting on top of the boy, who was nearly unconscious. Harold moved closer and realized that the spider person was draining the boy's life force. He also quickly realized that this was the leader the minions and the merchant had mentioned earlier. Harold was still in shock, as he never thought the leader would actually be a monster. In his eyes, she was the embodiment of a half-human, half-monster creature. Just then, the spider person noticed their presence, smiled, and asked who they were. Harold didn't introduce himself, but simply declared that he and Cecil were taking the boy home. However, the spider boss replied that wasn't going to happen, as she was about to put the boy in a cocoon. She further explained that the boy had tried to steal her precious merchandise, and now he had to pay the price for causing her so much trouble. She added that the boy himself would become her compensation. She also mentioned that the merchandise the boy tried to steal was her precious medicine, a potion that could cure any disease a human might have. Its price was never less than 50 million rubes. The spider person confessed that she didn't obtain the medicine legally, but with the power she possessed, she would be just fine. After hearing this, Harold suddenly remembered why the boy had yelled at his mother, declaring he would find a way to make money to save his sick father. Harold also realized that not only were they dealing with pirates, but their leader was a demi-human monster. That meant the situation couldn't possibly get any worse. Suddenly, the demi-human boss screamed, her power exploding like a Super Saiyan's, declaring that interrupting her while she was torturing the boy and speaking to her so rudely had made her furious. Right after, the spider person announced she would show them no mercy. Immediately, Cecil launched an attack with her katana. After the clash, she realized that the spider boss was incredibly strong. Harold followed up with a powerful strike from his spear, and afterward, he remarked that slashing her body was like cutting through metal. He decided to try attacking again, but this time with much more power. Harold's attack was so strong it sent the spider flying straight into the wall. As she fell, she was surprised that someone once as weak as Harold could summon such immense power. Despite knocking her into the wall, Harold sensed his blow probably didn't cause her much damage. Just then, Harold noticed the boy had been freed from the spider's grasp. So he signaled for Cecil to proceed with the plan and rescue the boy. Cecil acted immediately upon receiving the signal. However, Cecil didn't just save the boy, she also took the 50 million rube potion with her. The moment the spider leader discovered this, she screamed in a rage and swore she would kill both Harold and Cecil. Just then, her minions appeared, and she quickly informed them that the man before them was with a woman who had taken the boy and stolen the precious potion. She ordered them to pursue that woman at all costs and capture both her and the boy. The minions replied that they understood the order. Harold smirked, knowing that number of minions wouldn't be able to stop Cecil. But suddenly, the spider leader gave Harold a cold look and changed her mind, ordering her minions to attack him instead of chasing Cecil. As they rushed towards Harold, it was clear the main focus had shifted to him. Harold began the fight with vigor, and he easily defeated the first few minions that charged at him. The spider leader was truly disappointed by how pathetically her minions performed against Harold. However, the number of minions didn't seem to decrease, forcing Harold to fight continuously without a moment's rest. As a result, he felt like he had been fighting for over an hour. But in reality, only a few minutes had passed. By this point, the spider leader realized her minions were useless, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. Instantly, she spread her legs and secreted a white liquid towards Harold. But he easily dodged it. She then extended her arms, trying to grab him. But Harold managed to evade her for a while, until he landed on a rooftop. The spider leader noticed Harold had started to slow down and asked him where his initial vigor had gone. Then with a smirk, Harold replied that by controlling his energy output, he could conserve his mana. Harold knew his spear was powerful enough to destroy an entire nation. As long as he held on to it, he would be fine, but if he lost it, he'd be in serious trouble. Suddenly, a man with a melted face emerged from the ground. Upon seeing him, Harold realized he was the one who had been hit by the spider leader's white liquid. And from that, he deduced her liquid was actually acid. Right after this realization, the spider leader shot the liquid at Harold again. But luckily, he managed to dodge it just in time. At this point, Harold thought it was time to end things. He believed he had stalled long enough, and his stamina was at its limit. Harold turned and tried to escape, but while running, he tripped on thin air and slammed his face into the ground. Seeing this, the spider leader realized this was her chance to finish Harold off and lunged at him at high speed. As she closed in, Harold believed this was surely the end for him. Just then, something unexpected happened. From a distance, Addie got into her legendary sniping stance. A moment later, she fired a bullet from her rifle, creating a blinding flash like a bolt of lightning that struck the spider leader directly, causing her to scream in pain. After being hit, the spider leader's body immediately began to disintegrate. Just a few moments later, she collapsed to the ground. Her minions witnessed this, completely baffled as to what had just happened. They could only guess that their leader had just been struck by lightning. With their leader defeated, the minions knew they stood no chance against Harold alone, so they decided to retreat. After they left, Harold got up, surprised to see Atty standing in the distance. As soon as Atty saw Harold, she quickly ran over and threw her arms around him. Atty then said she didn't think she'd make it in time, so she was forced to use the lightning in the bullet. And of course, she made sure it wouldn't hit Harold. From Atty's words, Harold now understood that the brilliant flash of light he saw was created by her, and he was completely amazed by her power. Putting that aside, Harold was impressed that she had managed to find his location. With a blushing face, Atty replied that she had placed a mark on him, so she always knew where he was. Harold was surprised by this, so Atty explained she had done it with magic. Harold said he never knew this kind of magic existed, and also admitted it was really convenient, especially in the situation he was in. Atty said the magic was useful this time, but it wasn't omnipotent. The effect only lasts for a week, after which it has to be reapplied, or it will disappear. In short, Atty was just glad Harold was safe. Right after, Harold gently hugged her and apologized for making her worry so much. In response, Atty pleaded with Harold to take her with him whenever he might be in danger, and Harold promised he would. The two of them walked out of the cave, where they saw Cecil sitting on some rocks, the boy still unconscious. As soon as Cecil saw Harold coming out with a girl she didn't know, Cecil immediately asked who she was and how she got there. Harold quickly told Cecil to shut up and stop interrogating her, saying this wasn't the right time for so many questions. After a few minutes, Cecil reminded them that they didn't have much time and needed to leave quickly because the rain was getting very heavy. Even though they had a boat, they weren't sure if they could head in the right direction. Harold understood this was a dangerous situation, as he didn't want to risk their boat sinking in the middle of the ocean. But fortunately, a little while later, the sky began to clear up, which was the ideal time for them to set off. While they were rowing, Cecil suddenly announced that the boy's temperature had dropped drastically, even colder than when she'd brought him to safety. Looking closer, she noticed small spots appearing all over his body. The moment he heard that, Harold instantly realized the boy had been poisoned by the spider leader. Cecil continued to shake and shout at the boy in an attempt to wake him up, but all her efforts were in vain. She realized she had no choice but to give the boy the potion. The one the spider leader had claimed was expensive and could cure any illness. Harold knew the potion could cure diseases, but he figured it might also be effective against toxins. He also thought the potion might be what Cecil herself needed, but using it on the boy was more humane and logical, as his need was far greater. With tear-filled eyes, Cecil forced the potion into the boy's mouth. After a few seconds, the boy only coughed violently, leaving Cecil sitting there in stunned disbelief, unable to accept that such an expensive potion couldn't save him. At that moment, looking at the boy's body, Cecile came to the conclusion that he was beyond saving. When they returned after giving back the boat, the first thing they did was hold a proper burial for Matsudo. Harold knew who Matsudo's mother was. She loved her son dearly and was doing everything she could to find him. Above all, what she longed for most was to hold her son in her arms one more time. Such was the love of a mother like her. Because of this, Harold couldn't bring himself to show her Matsudo's lifeless body. He didn't even have the courage to tell her that her son had passed away. Harold thought of a better solution: to simply tell her that Matsudo had gone missing and that no one knew his whereabouts. Meanwhile, Cecil stood silently before the boy's grave, telling herself she'd gone through so much for the sole purpose of saving him. Even so, she didn't regret her decision, nor did she think that they could have saved him if they had tried harder. Cecil acted for herself. She wanted to save Matsudo in her own way. After this incident, Harold and Ati gave Cecil her space, as it seemed she had sorted through her thoughts. Perhaps that was one of the innate gifts of those who had vowed to live by the way of the sword. Weapons always have an intimate relationship with life. To use them responsibly, the wielder needs to grasp the fragile line between life and death. The same was true for Atie, who had fought for her life in the labyrinth. Before becoming a slave, Harold figured that Atie had probably felt the same way Cecil did. Clearly, Harold was the only one among them who had lived a normal life, and he'd never had the chance to get used to such painful events. Meanwhile, Atie realized that no matter how much she blamed herself for the situation, nothing could change the truth about Matsudo. But as long as Harold was alive, nothing else mattered to her. A few hours later, as Atie and Harold were walking through the city, they suddenly ran into Matsudo's mother, who was crying and clutching Harold's shoulders. She told them that Matsudo had disappeared, and that his father had passed away as well. His last request before dying was to see his son and stroke his head. But since Matsudo was gone, that wish was never fulfilled. Seeing Matsudo's mother weeping in agony, Harold suddenly remembered that Matsudo had been desperately searching for the medicine to save his father. But in his quest to save his father, Matsudo had lost his own life, and because he couldn't return in time, his father died too. Harold kept questioning his decisions in rescuing Matsudo, wondering if he could have done anything differently. He thought that perhaps if he had handled the situation better, Matsudo and his father might still be alive. But then Harold realized he shouldn't think that way. No matter how he looked at it, the fact was that Matsudo had been poisoned. And they had made the right call in giving him the potion. Even if they could have changed a few minor things, the final outcome probably would have been the same. At that point, Harold didn't know what to think anymore. Matsudo's mother, sensing there was nothing left to say, apologized for bothering them. Then she vowed to keep searching for her son until she found him, because he was the only thing she'd left to love in this world. She quickly left to continue her search, and as she walked away, a sense of guilt washed over Harold and Ati. A few hours later, they returned to the ship. Several days passed, and during that time, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Finally, The night before they were to leave town arrived. Over time, the incident with Matsudo began to fade, becoming a part of the past. As tragic as it was, Matsudo wasn't the only one who had died that day, so Harold tried to tell himself that it shouldn't haunt him so much. However, Harold couldn't stop wondering when his own end would come. He recalled dangerous moments, like when his house burned down, and wondered what would have happened if he'd been sleeping inside. Or when he fought the spider leader, he thought about what would have happened if Ati hadn't attacked in time. A few minutes later, Ati entered the room, wearing a seductive nightgown. Harold glanced at her once and immediately became flustered. She noticed something was wrong with him and asked how he was doing. Harold held his head, saying it was nothing. But Ati could clearly see he was uncomfortable. He looked like he was suffering from some kind of pain. Before he could deny it any further, Ati suddenly grabbed his head and kissed him, their tongues meeting in a bold exchange. Harold was surprised by Ati's actions, but before he could say anything, she told him that from what she'd heard, when a man is in pain, making love to a woman without overthinking it is the best medicine for him. Or so she'd heard. Harold couldn't stop staring at Ati's gorgeous body as she undressed and told him to do as he pleased. He took a deep breath and asked if she was sure about this. After Ate agreed, Harold threw her onto the bed and pinned her down, telling her he wouldn't be able to stop even if she asked him to halfway through. After all, she was the one who told him to have his way with her, so Harold was determined to see it through. The two started with passionate kisses, followed by embraces, moans, and lustful movements. They ended the night satisfied, while all the other men on the ship were jealous of Harold's ability to make a woman scream with pleasure. The next morning, while Ati was still fast asleep, Harold was already awake. He sat there, realizing and unable to believe what he had done with Ati the previous night. However, he could justify it by telling himself that Ati was the one who urged him to do as he pleased. But if they were to go by the facts of what happened, he would have to use her own words as his shield. Otherwise, it could look like he had taken advantage of her. At the same time, Harold believed Ati only said those things because she cared about him. It was very likely she didn't expect him to take her words so seriously. Even so, Harold knew that Ahi had no choice but to accept if he wanted her. Because of the slave collar she wore, if Ati disobeyed him, and the collar interpreted it as a hostile act, she could lose her life. However, Harold was certain that he wanted Ati for more than just her body. As Harold thought deeper, his mind started to get jumbled, to the point where just being in the same room with Ati made him feel hot, as if he couldn't control himself. He then decided to take a walk around the ship to clear his head, but it didn't seem to do any good. While Harold was still lost in thought, Varen happened to walk by and sat down next to him. Harold started to wonder why Varen was sitting next to him. Varen, noticing Harold's discomfort, told him not to act so weird and that he just wanted to talk for a bit. Right after that, Varen said that he truly wanted to thank Harold for taking care of Cecil the other day. At first, Harold was a bit confused about what Varen was referring to, but he immediately remembered that he was talking about the incident with Matsudo. Harold hadn't expected Cecil to have told her grandfather about that. Harold humbly replied that he really didn't do much, and there was no need to thank him. But Varen still insisted on thanking Harold. Then Harold said that Cecil was much stronger than him, so even if he hadn't been there, she would have been fine. Varen then replied that being strong or weak, winning or losing, are completely different concepts. He knew that Cecil had an impulsive side, which Harold had also noticed before. Varen then warned Harold to be careful of Cecil's impulsive side, as that could be the reason he loses his life one day. Cecil had told Varen that she wasn't happy with Harold's behavior during the last mission, and that made Varen immediately realize that Harold was the one who had kept her in check. Varen expressed his deep gratitude to Harold for that. Varen also mentioned that when he called Harold out, he could tell from his face that Harold was dealing with something very troublesome. Harold admitted it and replied that he was just in a situation where he needed to clear his head. Varen understood and said he had a solution for that. A few minutes later, Harold wasn't sure how it happened, but he and Varen were now the center of a wooden weapons spar. Harold with a wooden spear, and Varen with a wooden sword. Varen added that if you want to clear your head, this is the best way to do it. Since Varen was a blood relative of Cecil's, Harold had expected that Varen would have a similar sword style to hers. Before the match began, Varen told Harold not to worry about him and to come at him with everything he had. However, Harold didn't feel very comfortable doing that, especially considering Varen was an old man. Just then, Varen held his sword with a professional grip, and Harold felt an incredibly terrifying aura emanating from him, something only a highly skilled person could produce. Harold immediately wondered who this old man really was. So, right after, he introduced himself as the former sword saint Varen Myers. Harold was stunned to learn that Varen once held the title of Sword Saint. Despite his own inexperience in martial arts, Harold understood the significance of that title. Cecil's strength was also clear proof of this, and he now realized that she had learned swordsmanship from her grandfather, a sword saint, even if that title was now in the past. Without wasting any time, Varen asked Harold if he was ready for the match. Sensing Harold's nervousness, Varen smiled and asked him what was wrong, reassuring him that he could think of this as a shoulder to lean on for now. Even with him saying that, Harold confessed that he was afraid if he attacked right away, he would be countered. Varen stroked his chin and replied that it was certainly a possibility, while also letting Harold know that if he intended to run, he wouldn't let him get away. Harold gritted his teeth in frustration, as it didn't take much to see the clear difference in their abilities. At that moment, Harold just wanted to drop the wooden spear and run away. But after a few seconds of hesitation, Varen lost his patience seeing Harold just standing there and decided to attack first. Varen vanished right before Harold's eyes, and in an instant, Harold was hit by a powerful slash from his wooden sword. Even so, Harold managed to block it in time with his spear. Varen praised Harold for his quick reaction, but also noticed that Harold's eyes couldn't keep up with his speed. Harold then admitted that he couldn't see Varen's attack, which led Varen to believe that Harold had blocked his blow purely on instinct. Meanwhile, Harold was bewildered by Varen's calmness and wondered if he was really holding back his strength. After facing a barrage of attacks from Varen, Harold wondered how much longer he could hold out. However, as expected, he couldn't hold on for long and eventually lost the match. After the match, Harold realized he had only lasted a few minutes. Varen asked if the sparring session had helped Harold calm down. As Harold was still on the floor, Varen offered his hand to help him up. After all, Varen was right. Harold really did feel his head was clearer after the match. He wondered if maybe it was because he was too exhausted from being beaten up. Right then, Harold decided he would apologize to Ati, which he felt was the best decision for the current situation. Harold thanked Varen for helping him find a solution to his troubled state of mind. Varen accepted his thanks and reminded him that he was only human, and that it was perfectly normal to feel confused from time to time. Varen shared that even he himself, back when he was a true sword saint, had experienced worries and struggles. He said that there are people in this world who brag about cutting off all anxieties, but he saw that as a lousy excuse for completely abandoning their responsibilities. Harold was surprised to learn that someone as strong as Varen still worried and hesitated about many things. Varen continued, saying that even now, he still worries about many things. He told of a time when he had run away, which confused Harold. Varen explained that at the time, war was about to break out on the northeastern continent. The Empire was preparing to start a war to unify the continent, and it was going to happen soon. So he had chosen to leave the Empire to protect his precious granddaughter, Cecil, from the war. As a former sword saint, Varen still received important information, and after a thorough investigation, he discovered that the Empire was in a state of chaos. They were building up an augmented army for the war, and were even using terrible dark arts. He also mentioned that the Empire was currently experimenting with the synthesis of humans and demons. Harold was shocked to hear about the synthesis and wondered if the spider leader he had faced before was a result of these experiments. Varen said that Cecil had told him about the human-shaped demon Harold had fought, and he immediately guessed that she came from the Empire. After escaping the Empire, she had become a bandit. But it was also entirely possible that the human-shaped demons in the labyrinth had rebelled and escaped to the outside. Although it was a very rare occurrence, Varen explained that many such demons were inherently extremely violent and usually didn't hide their power. From Varen's words, it seemed that in his view, if he and Cecil were to fight these demons, he would consider them to be weaklings. Harold also had a good feeling that if it were Varen, he could slice the spider leader in two in an instant. Harold realized that the northeastern continent was indeed more troublesome than he had ever thought. And perhaps it was a good thing they had left the continent early. Varen was trying to protect Cecil from a war with an unknown outcome. To do so, he had to leave behind his friends and loved ones in his homeland. It was a decision he made after much deliberation. However, this decision has always haunted him, as if he were forced to do it. And sometimes he wonders if he made the right choice. Harold found it strange that, despite such immense worries, Varen didn't seem sad. Perhaps it was because Varen had accepted and faced his anxieties. Meanwhile, Harold was tormenting himself and struggling to stay calm, but perhaps that wasn't so bad either. As Harold returned to his room on the ship, he found a ring and then went down to the onboard shop. There, he saw a sample of silver clay in a jar. The shopkeeper said the clay wasn't very pure, but it came from a labyrinth and was priced at around 100,000 to 200,000 rubes. Harold had come here intending to buy a gift for Ati as an apology, and he thought a handmade gift would be more sincere. So he decided to do just that. He asked the shopkeeper if he had any tools for carving silver. The man replied that he had some tools in the back, and if Harold bought the silver clay, he could use them. The shopkeeper considered Harold's request to borrow the tools and asked if he knew how to work with silver. With a calm demeanor, Harold replied that he had been a silversmith for about 15 years. Before entering the room, Harold paused at the door, thinking about the first thing he would say to Ati when he saw her. After a few seconds of hesitation, he finally mustered enough courage to go inside. When he entered the room, he saw Ati feeding the snake they had caught on their previous mission. Just as he expected, Ati was very happy to see Harold return. Harold asked her what she had been up to since he was gone, and Ati replied that she had been busy taking care of Echidna, the name they had given the snake. Ati sensed that something was unsettling Harold, so she asked him if anything was wrong. After standing there awkwardly for a moment, Harold finally gathered the courage to apologize to Ati for what happened the previous night. Ati seemed confused, not understanding why Harold was apologizing. Harold explained that he felt he had taken advantage of her words to pressure her, and he just wanted to say he was sorry for that. He then placed a beautiful silver ring on her finger as an apology gift. Ati noticed the ring was exquisitely crafted and wondered if Harold had intentionally bought it for her. Harold replied that he had made the ring himself, and that he was also a skilled silversmith. At that moment, Ati was amazed to learn that the ring was custom-made just for her. Harold also explained that the silver ring had benefits, like protecting against evil and demons. Ati was incredibly grateful for the gesture, but then told Harold that he had completely misunderstood the situation. She explained that she was actually very happy about the night before. She didn't want it to be too rough. And Harold had treated her gently and considerately. It was a memorable first experience for her, being loved with such special care. Seeing Harold's blushing face, Adi guessed he hadn't expected her to react that way, and probably didn't even believe her. Right after that, Ati pushed Harold down onto the bed and got on top of him. Adi told Harold that if that was the case, she had no choice but to prove it. Then she leaned down and gave Harold a passionate kiss. Next, she whispered in his ear, asking if he was ready for another session with her. With an obvious physical reaction that Harold couldn't hide, he had no choice but to agree. While they were making love, Adi was on top of Harold and asked if she was too heavy for him, to which Harold replied that it was fine. Adi pleaded with him to let her stay on top all night, because she truly loved him and wanted to express her affection on her own terms. Even so, Adi still blamed Harold. for making her feel so vulnerable and satisfied. As they continued, the bed shook, and from a distance, Echidna just stood there, horrified at the sight. It was clear she was traumatized from watching them. A few hours later, a crew member announced that they were approaching the island and would be docking for supplies for 5 days. When the ship docked, Harold and Adi disembarked, and Harold suggested they take a walk to sightsee, hoping to find something interesting. Adi agreed with the plan and added that with so many people around, there was bound to be something exciting to discover. As they walked around town, Harold remarked that the area had a similar atmosphere to the port town they were in before the ship set sail. However, Adi noted that military ports have a completely different feel. Adi went on to explain that they might have the chance to visit a few military ports during their journey, and she believed Harold would be surprised by how different they were from this place. Harold was a little confused, unsure of what the difference was. Ati explained that military ports are usually much more solemn, not bustling like it is here, and there are always sailors and soldiers walking the streets. After hearing Adi's explanation, Harold admitted that what she described actually sounded intimidating, but Adi told him to relax, as the strictness of the place was what had kept the area safe over the years. However, she also said the area wasn't perfect and still had some specific problems. Looking at Harold's worried face, Adi noticed he was particularly interested in these problems. She explained that in a military port area, many people work at night. So there are quite a few related issues. The large number of soldiers means there's a very high ratio of men, and most of them tend to get drawn into brothels, leading to many families being torn apart. When there's a strange disease outbreak or something similar, the clinics are often overwhelmed. Adi added that she was scared those diseases might cause Harold to suffer, so she pleaded with him to take good care of himself if they ever visited a military port. As a man, Ati guessed Harold would be interested in places like that. Ati admitted she couldn't force him not to go, but she still felt a little jealous thinking about him being satisfied by a woman other than her. Before she could finish her sentence, Harold quickly reassured Ati, telling her she didn't need to worry. He would never need to go to those places, because he was already completely satisfied with her. As soon as Adi heard this, her face turned bright red, showing that Harold had succeeded in making her heart flutter. About half an hour later, they walked through a beautiful park and decided to sit down on a nearby bench. They both sat in awkward silence for a minute. Then, right after, Adi took a deep breath and told Harold she felt relieved and had grown really fond of him. She was able to be physically intimate with him because she was the one who made the decision for herself. Ati continued, saying that if Harold had forced himself on her from the very day he bought her, she probably would have resisted. Harold remembered the slave trader telling him that if a slave defied their master's will, a sharp needle would be injected through their neck from the slave collar they wore. As Harold mulled that over, he curiously asked Ati when this had happened and when she had started to grow fond of him. With a smile, Ati said that ever since the day Harold suddenly kissed her, her feelings for him had steadily grown. She also recalled that on the northeastern continent, where many people discriminated against dark elves like her, Harold had never treated her that way. This was what made her so drawn to the way Harold desired her, not just as a slave, but as a woman. Hearing this confession, Harold felt he could trust Adi completely. He decided it was no longer necessary for her to wear the slave collar and tried to take it off. But then he realized he didn't know how to remove the collar. Before Harold could even finish that thought, Adi said that the collar was proof that she belonged to Harold, and she had no intention of taking it off. At this, Harold was surprised and admitted that he never thought Ati would say something like that. And to be honest, he found it quite alluring. After continuing their stroll, Harold happened to see a gigantic ship, which was clearly a luxury cruise liner. He remembered seeing a similar vessel at a nearby port town. Harold realized that the people on this ship were probably being transported from the northeastern continent. Just then, Harold sensed something strange and looked behind him. Adi was confused, not understanding why Harold did that, and asked him if something was wrong. But in reality, there was nothing noteworthy behind them. Harold began to wonder if his eyes were playing tricks on him, and if he was just imagining things. The next day, Harold was playing fetch with Echidna around the house, and Adia seemed quite happy to just stand and watch. Harold noticed this and asked if she wanted to try throwing the stick herself. Ati agreed, and Echidna immediately caught the stick in its mouth. Right at that moment, a letter was slipped under their door, announcing an upcoming night market event. Harold was surprised, as he didn't remember seeing any interesting places on their walk. He then asked Adia if she wanted to go, and she replied that she wouldn't mind, which was a positive response. That evening at the night market, Harold noticed that the event was drawing a huge crowd, and wondered if it was because of the flyers they had received. Addie had a feeling that the flyers played a big part in attracting people, but she also thought there might be another reason, though she wasn't sure what. As they strolled through the market, they noticed there were a lot of casinos in the area. Since this was a small island that served as a stopover for many ships, Harold figured such conditions were perfect for casinos to operate. Meanwhile, at the most popular casino, Cecil was gambling with two men. She was so good that her opponent started to suspect she was cheating. With a slightly flushed face, Cecil replied that she just had perfect eyesight. As Harold and Ati passed by that casino, Harold heard a familiar voice that he was sure belonged to Cecil. Sweat started to form on Harold's forehead, and he silently prayed that Varen wouldn't discover his beloved niece's gambling addiction. Although Varen seemed distant and calm, Harold knew that he was a very serious person. This made Harold wonder how Varen would feel if he knew his precious niece was a gambling addict. Harold realized he owed Varen a great deal for the valuable advice he'd given him. He began to wonder if telling Varen about Cecil's gambling habit was the right thing to do. But Harold quickly realized that might be going too far, so he decided they would both pretend they hadn't heard Cecil's voice. Afterwards, Harold realized they had gotten too sidetracked, so he suggested they get back to their original plan and continue exploring the night market. The next day, Harold and Ati were playing with Echidna again. While playing, however, Harold felt like Echidna's body was getting bigger over time. Even though there were no signs of shedding, Harold began to wonder how long this snake had been growing, and even suspected whether Echidna was truly a snake at all. Meanwhile, Harold and Ati heard a commotion outside. They quickly ran to see what was happening, and when they stepped outside, they saw Varen storming into the building with Cecil in tow. Apparently, he had caught Cecil gambling at the night market and had immediately dragged her back. Varen was scolding Cecil, but she tried to justify herself, saying she hadn't lost anything and had won all her bets. She even boasted that she could clearly see the faces of the dice and cards, easily predicting everything, like how each card would be turned over. With those skills, she claimed there was no way she could ever lose. Varen saw that Cecil was still unrepentant for her actions, so he decided to turn her over and give her a good spanking for misusing the eyes she had trained for swordsmanship on such improper things. Cecil screamed as she was spanked and called out to Harold for help. At that moment, Ati got angry seeing Cecil call Harold by his name without any honorifics. Harold noticed the change in Adi's mood, so he asked her what was wrong. Adi replied curtly that it was nothing. Harold continued to poke Adi's cheek since she looked so adorable, and as soon as she heard this compliment, Ati's cheeks turned bright red, showing she had been successfully rizzed up. A little later, the two of them decided to get something to eat and entered a small diner. As they sat down, Harold overheard two men talking about a fire that had happened early that morning. A house had been completely burned down, and the house next to it was half burned as the fire had spread. This made Harold feel sad, as he knew all too well what it felt like to lose a home. Ati remarked that the situation sounded terrifying, and Harold agreed, wondering if the house was burned down intentionally or if it was just due to carelessness with fire. In any case, they would be leaving the island the next day, and Harold was surprised that he was getting so worked up over an unrelated issue. As they were walking home, Ati said that after leaving the island, she wanted them to head to the western continent. She figured there would probably be at least one more stopover on the way. After thinking for a moment, Harold agreed that it was a good idea. Just then, they ran into Cecil, who did not look happy. Cecil called Harold a cold-hearted jerk and snapped that he wasn't the kind of person she'd imagined. She added that she couldn't believe he would just stand by and do nothing while a girl was getting hit. Addie then asked Harold what he planned to do about Cecil's annoying complaints. Harold replied that it was best they didn't get involved with Cecil's business this time, but after thinking about Varen and all he had done for him, Harold decided to tell Cecil that he would protect her from now on. As soon as she heard this, Cecil acknowledged Harold's kindness. However, Addie started to feel a little jealous. With a pouting face, she said that Cecil was a small, slender, and cute girl. So, of course, Harold would want to protect her. Harold was confused by Addie's attitude and asked her why she was suddenly acting like that. Addie just replied that it was nothing, but her face looked worried. Harold knew for sure that something was wrong, so he assumed Addie was just in a bad mood. When they returned to their room that evening, Harold suggested they both go up to the ship's deck to look at the night sky. He told Ati he wanted to do this because he thought it would be wonderful to admire the beautiful view with her. Ati agreed, saying it was a great idea. Just then, Echidna jumped out of Ati's shirt, signaling that it wanted to come along to enjoy the view too. When they got to the deck, they were greeted by the beautiful night view of the city. Even though it was just an ordinary scene, Harold felt that what mattered wasn't what you wanted to see, but what you were witnessing right in front of you. Harold turned and noticed the smile on Ati's face. She was clearly enjoying herself and was very happy. After watching the stars for a while, Harold suggested they head back to their room. On their way back, they happened to run into Varen, and from his annoyed expression, Harold could tell he wasn't happy. Harold asked Varen what brought him out so late at night. Varen replied that he was waiting for Cecil, his foolish granddaughter. Looking at Varen's eyes, it was clear he wasn't pleased at all. Harold guessed Varen's bad mood might have something to do with him being upset with Cecil. Harold asked Varen what he planned to do when he returned, and he replied that he was going to hang Cecil upside down. He felt there was no other way, and that it was the only punishment he could think of to teach her a lesson. Varen added that he would tie her up and let her reflect on her wrongdoings while suspended in the air. Harold felt that seemed a bit extreme, and he told Varen he thought the punishment was a bit much. Varen, with a crazed look in his eyes, asked Harold if he was taking Cecil's side. Harold replied that he was just expressing his opinion and wasn't taking anyone's side. Varen immediately told Harold to shut up. After that, Harold decided not to argue any further, as he didn't want to get yelled at again. Still, Harold thought that Varen's way of treating his beloved granddaughter was a bit too harsh. Cecil never listened to Varen, and Harold remarked that children often don't care how their foolish actions affect their parents' hearts. Varen said that Harold had just made a very accurate metaphor. With a serious face, Varen explained that he was usually very merciful with his grandchildren, mostly because they were so cute. But this time, he couldn't let it slide. Cecil had actually used her eyes trained to be a swordswoman's, for gambling. Varen didn't spend his precious time training Cecil just for her to use that skill for such a dark purpose. After hearing Varen speak, Harold understood that Varen wasn't angry because Cecil was gambling, but because she had used an ability specially trained for swordsmanship, which devalued her as a swordswoman. Putting that matter aside, Varen noticed the creature peeking out from Adi's shirt, so he asked them about it. Harold replied that it was their pet, named Echidna. Varen looked surprised and said he was curious why they would choose a demon as a pet. Harold was stunned to discover that Echidna had been a demon all along. Varen was also surprised to learn that Harold and Eti had no idea they'd been raising a demon this whole time. However, Harold just replied that he'd decided to keep Echidna as a pet because he found it interesting, and now that he thought about it, he realized he didn't really care if it was a demon or not. Harold wondered how Varen could tell that Echidna was a demon. Varen replied that he had been in a labyrinth before and had seen a creature that looked exactly like it. He also added that Atiye had known Echidna was a demon for a long time, which shocked Harold even more. Atty then explained that she had always wondered if Harold knew echidna was a demon before he decided to bring it along. At this point, Harold felt extremely embarrassed. Varen went on to say that some people have the ability to tame demons, and Atty agreed, but added that it usually only happened in stories, and it was very rare for a demon like Echidna to be friendly with humans. Harold was getting tired of this topic, so he suggested they change the subject. He started by saying he really hoped Cecil would come back soon. Varen, with that crazed look in his eyes again, replied that she had better come back, or else she would face unimaginable consequences. Harold laughed and offered to help Varen search for Cecil in the city, since they all agreed that naughty children needed to be punished. He even joked that he would feel better if he got to see Cecil suspended in shame. A few minutes later, they got ready and began searching for Cecil in the city. As they passed the casino where they had found her before, they noticed they couldn't hear her voice coming from inside anymore. So their new plan was to keep checking other casinos until they found her. As they were passing a nearby casino, Atty told Harold she could hear Cecil's voice coming from inside. Harold was relieved to have found Cecil without too much effort. He thanked Atty, saying that thanks to her, they'd been saved from a much longer search. Harold told Atty that if she ever needed a favor in the future, he would do his best to help. Atty replied that in that case she wanted them to have another farming session. This made Harold agree and blush shyly, happy at the thought of getting to spend more time with her. As they approached the casino where Cecil was, the room suddenly burst into flames. Other gamblers ran out screaming that some maniac had set the whole place on fire because he lost a bet to a girl. The fire was so intense that Harold couldn't see Cecil right away. After a few seconds of searching, he spotted Cecil in a fighting stance, her sword drawn, and she was screaming at the guy who had set the place on fire just for losing to her. The man laughed maniacally, saying it was all Cecil's fault for winning non-stop. If she'd just lost once, things wouldn't have come to this. Cecil angrily called him a bastard and lunged at him. But before she could strike, Harold moved in and grabbed her arm, telling her to stop being foolish. Based on the earlier conversation, Harold understood what was happening. But if they didn't focus on putting out the fire, things would get much worse. However, looking at Cecil's face, it was clear she wanted to keep confronting the man who started the fire. Harold knew that if Cecil didn't cooperate, convincing her would be very difficult. But suddenly, Cecil fainted and fell into Harold's arms,